The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
Patriotism is the product of love of country, of the traditions, culture, and characteristics of our people. And the Irish language is part of that heritage.
KTCA-TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation, which has emerged to statehood in our times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Modern Problems. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
In this, the last lecture of our series, I have thought it best to bring us up to date to face some of the grave problems which beset Ireland today. However delightful the literature of Ireland may be, however interesting her history has been, we cannot forget that we live in the present, and that the present is often a time of anxiety and of problems. The three problems which I shall identify for you in this talk are the industrialization of the country, the partition of the country, and the revival or the restoration of the Irish language as the vernacular of the people. These three problems are quite related. Obviously, the industrialization, for instance, has a great bearing upon one of the major ills of the country, the immigration of huge numbers annually. Obviously, too, the industrialization of the country has a great relationship to the partitioning of the country. And obviously also, the question of the restoration of the Irish language as the national language must be related to these other questions. Possibly now, before we take these up one by one in detail, I shall show you a few illustrations of a modern Ireland, the new face of Ireland, a change that a good number of people might have given many years of their lives to have lived to see. Here you see a modern industrial turf plant in Ireland. There are other examples of heavy industry in Ireland. This is an illustration of part of the so-called Shannon hydroelectric scheme. Now, both of these enterprises illustrate the native pluck, if I might put that in antithesis, the native pluck and foreign capital. Because our papers these days are filled with stories about British, German, Belgian, Swedish, United States, all kinds of foreign capital pouring into Ireland. And while this is true, and while many an American industrialist and industrialists from other nations see in Ireland an opportunity to make a handsome profit for themselves, while this is all true, we must not overlook the fact that the industrialization of Ireland had begun, and indeed in some respects has well continued, without foreign capital. Therefore, for this talk, I take as an illustration the growth and development of the Irish shipping industry. This is completely an example of native ingenuity, perseverance, willpower, and pride. Certainly, Ireland has ancient connections with the sea. An island must necessarily have. And while I can't review those for you in so brief a time as we have in this program, I perhaps might remind you that anciently the Irish sailed the seas quite widely, ranging indeed to settlements in Iceland. But all of that is ancient history. It's ancient history also that Irishmen have played prominent parts in the navies of foreign countries. The father of the American Navy, a Wexford man, John Barry. The father of the Argentine Navy, a Mayo man, William Brown. The father of the Navy of Ecuador, Thomas Wright. This is history and may be known to you all. The important thing for us to remember is that when the modern Irish state was born in 1922, as a result of the treaty between England and Ireland, at this particular time, Ireland had virtually no shipping industry left. In the centuries previous to 1922, Britain had found it inadvisable for her own economic and financial interests to allow much of an economic or particularly industrial or mercantile development in Ireland. I suppose this is natural. Self-interest dictated that Ireland not be allowed to engage in anything that might look like commercial rivalry. The result was, of course, that industrially speaking, Ireland came into the 20th century, one might say, as naked as a newborn child. In 1922, when the new state was born, there were too many problems for Ireland to think immediately of reviving a shipping industry. Indeed, there hardly seemed any need to do so. So the remarkable thing was that although this Irish state, born, remember, only 40 years or 41 years ago, although this Irish state had achieved some kind of limited autonomy in 1922, it nonetheless was completely dependent upon England for all of its shipping. The Second World War taught Ireland that freedom meant a great many kinds of enterprises, a great many types of self-reliance and other aspects of one's personal responsibilities. The result was, in World War II, Ireland found herself completely at a loss. Needed supplies of fertilizer, of wheat, of foodstuffs necessary for the nation, needed supplies could not be imported because, naturally enough, those ships which had been in the Irish service but which had been owned by England were, of course, recalled to English service. After all, we can realize how badly needed they were at home. But of course, this didn't help the Irish to find that the ships which had helped them previously, which had plied back and forth between Ireland and other parts of the world, which had made their living doing so, that these were recalled now because they were British-owned, was of no immediate help. Ireland really found herself in the most dire circumstances. New and budding industries in Ireland could not get a supply of raw materials. Although there were plentiful supplies of livestock at home, for instance, there was definitely a shortage of grains for their feeding. And so this multiplied throughout the whole economic system, with the result that in 1941, in March 1941, it was determined in Ireland that a shipping industry would have to be established. This was easier said than done, but the state subscribed 51% of the capital. However, the country, the world, the Western world, was at war, and all ships were tied up in one way or another. With great difficulty, Ireland succeeded in getting a ship here and there, and I mean just that. One, for instance, that had been abandoned in the high seas and towed to northern Spain, this was purchased by Ireland. It took months and months of negotiations just to get it back to Ireland. Likewise, a Chilean ship, after months and months of negotiation, was acquired by Ireland. So now Ireland had two ships. Even sailing vessels were pressed into service. And this tiny industry, this mercantile idea, beginning with difficultly acquired vessels in 1941, has so grown that by 1959 it was thought feasible economically to build a shipyard in Cork, or rather, I suppose, to rehabilitate and extend an old shipyard in Cork. This was done, and in 1961 was launched one of the largest ships, in fact, the largest ship built in the Republic of Ireland. This excludes Belfast, of course, which has the greatest shipworks in Ireland. This is a 15,000-ton ship called the Irish Rowan. Interestingly, most of the Irish ships are named after trees. In 1963, this very same shipyard has built a 24,000-ton vessel. And now you see these flags flying on Irish ships for the first time in centuries. It is a remarkable thrill for an Irishman to realize that his flag did not acquire a legal right upon the high seas of the world until the 1950s. That was the time when the last vestige of control was wrested away, or shall I say, adjusted or bargained away from British authorities. Well, now this is one example. This shipyard has built a 24,000-ton ship for a Montreal firm, a 730-foot ore carrier, which, by the way, makes use of a new propeller for that type vessel, which propeller, although it was made in Sweden, it was not made in Ireland, is the largest of its kind in the world. I quote this as the briefest, most sketchy kind of fact to show that in 20 or 22 years, from 1941, the Irish, starting with nothing, have built up a shipping industry which has now given them 179,000 tons of shipping afloat on the seas of the world. And this, of course, is only a small portion of what the Irish shipping industry hopes to be able to float. It is one example of native pluck without the assistance of foreign capital. I do not minimize the importance, the absolute need to Ireland of foreign capital, but I give this as an example of something that will be necessary for that foreign capital to work with. That is native ability, imagination, daring. Now I should like to move to another one of the modern problems, the problem of partition. Partition, of course, is a 20th century word. It has become all too familiar to us. The partition of Germany, the partition of Korea, the partition of Ireland. Now, I would submit that in the case of Ireland, certainly there's a great deal of clarity surrounding the question. Ireland is a small island. It isn't much larger than the smallest of our states, and it is, of course, smaller than almost any state that you can mention. So it's a very small country. Secondly, it is an island, so it has a geographical unity and integrity. Now, if we turn and examine history, we find there is no evidence to suggest the desirability or the need for the partitioning of the country. So that geographically and historically, we can say that this partitioning, which took place in 1920 by a British Act of Parliament, this partitioning is absolutely without precedent in the history of the country and seems to carry no sanction from the geographic features of the country. We might turn to history, for instance, to remark that the northern part of Ireland, the northeastern part of Ireland, which has been cut off or which has been partitioned from the larger body of Ireland, this is the home of the two greatest names in Irish history, the O'Neills and the O'Donnells. We might also point out that Belfast, the capital of the northeastern part of Ireland, that Belfast itself is the city in which the rebel movement of the very last years of the 18th century, the United Irishmen, the very city in which this movement took its origins. So that with that brief appeal to history, we might let the appeal to history lie. If we turn to the literature of the country, we discover that the national hero of Ireland, Cuchulainn, and the national, I don't know whether to call her a heroine or the national beauty of Ireland, Deirdre, Both of these characters are people of the north. If we turn to the religion of Ireland, we find that the seat of both the Catholic and the Protestant churches, the national seat, the primatial see, talking in terms of bishops, the primatial see is in Northern Ireland. Or if we consult religious tradition, we find that the grave of Patrick and Bridget and Columkill, traditionally we have no, I suppose, final scientific compelling proof, but by tradition these three saints are buried in one grave in Downpatrick in the north of Ireland. So that when we turn to history, when we turn to literature, when we turn to religion, we find evidence for the unity of Ireland. We find, as a matter of fact, that certain ideals of the country are really enshrined in that section which has now been cut off from the historic nation. If we turn for our last evidence to the proof that we might gather from language, again we find an interesting corroboration of the unity and integrity of the country. If we take the very name Belfast, what is it but an anglicized form of Baelfirste, which is the Irish for the mouth of the river Farset, Baelfirste. If we take the names of the counties of Northern Ireland, if we take the names of the towns, Limavady, Cushendall, Ballynahinch, if we take any of these names, Lisburn, we find that these are all anglicized forms of the original Irish names of the area. So that our evidence now, whether it's historical, whether it's literary, whether it's religious or linguistic, our evidence all points to the fact of unity for the entirety of the country. Then, how can we talk about a border? I can show you how unnatural that border is. I can illustrate it for you by this picture of a house through which the border cuts. And this itself, I suppose, would give us some sort of dramatic and graphic proof of the fact that the border itself was so artificial. It runs through this house so that one part of the house lies in the so-called 26 counties, that is the larger part of the country, and the other part of the house lies in the 6 counties, or that part which we commonly call Northern Ireland. Well, obviously, if the border is so unnatural, it's going to be provocative of trouble. And this picture, which was taken in 1960, shows a scene in a Northern Ireland town, a sandbagged police barracks. You might see the lamp in the middle of the picture, just beyond the sandbagging there, which shows the entrance to a police barracks, as the term is used in Ireland instead of, as we call it, police station. This, of course, illustrates a most unfortunate period of the recent past when the so-called Irish Republican Army was carrying on its guerrilla activities in Northern Ireland. Now, it's unfortunate that this has occurred more than once in these counties since the inception of their government in 1922. And certainly none of us wants to take the air here to advocate that kind of disruption of civil life. The 26 county government did its best to bring to an end this kind of activity by cooperating with the government of the 6 counties. But the mere fact that the underground movement exists is, I think, in itself evidence of a certain kind of unrest present implicit in the partitioning situation. When King George opened the Irish the Parliament in Belfast in 1920, he himself spoke a wish. He said that he hoped this division of the country would not endure. He himself recognized in his words that it was a most unnatural division of the country. Adlai Stevenson, our UN representative, a short while ago, just a matter of weeks ago, made a reference at a meeting of the United Nations to the one-party government in Northern Ireland and gave it as an example of a certain kind of undesirable system of government. Whatever it may be, the partition of the country is unnatural, without justification in history, and is not, as some people think, simply a matter of religious differences. Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants in ages past have got along very well, have at other times quarreled, but I don't think any of them seriously, much before the advent of our own time, accepted the idea of a separation of counties simply on the basis of religious population. Even this was not quite done in the 20th century because some of the areas which are screened off from the rest of the country have a majority of a different religion. Well, at any rate, the common market, for instance, offered a possible solution. If England and Ireland had entered the common market, the border would have disappeared. It would have had no practical cause or reason for existence. This, however, was not entirely welcome to the government in the north, strange as it may seem. And at the present moment, the government in the north, and I think we must express a certain degree of concern, because after all, there is no cause for rejoicing in a social disaster or social ill. But the government in the north is experiencing one of the most severe unemployment crises in the whole of the British Isles or of the United Kingdom. The unemployment in Northern Ireland is far greater than in Scotland, Wales, or England itself. And only today I received my paper from Ireland, which illustrates in its headlines one of the problems being faced in this area. The factory in the north, which had been producing airplanes in the past, has now been deprived of that contract. These airplanes will be built in England. The result is that some of the industries of the north are suffering terribly, while at the same time the industrialization of the rest of the country is growing, not by leaps and bounds or magically, but consistently and steadily. What the future will bring, we don't know, but it is a great problem. Now, the third of our problems, this trinity of interrelated problems, the third of these deals with the Irish language. It is the determined effort of the government of the 26 counties to restore the Irish tongue as the native tongue, as the vernacular of the people. In other words, it is their determination that Irish shall be the chief language and English the second language. What is envisioned here is a nation that will be bilingual, as many European nations are. Now, what are the problems here? You can well imagine them, but let me review historically. Irish has been the speech of the whole of the island of Ireland for something like 20 or more centuries. That is, before Christ, the language was spoken on this island, and after Christ, it was the only language on the island. And this continued, of course, until the English invasions, beginning at the end of the 12th century. Obviously, the first of the English invasions didn't disturb the language of the country very much. But as the centuries wore on, from the 12th on, English naturally extended its sphere of influence. Nonetheless, the Irish tongue proved to be very assimilative, and it easily held its own, forcing more than one English parliament to pass a law forbidding the English who settled in Ireland, forbidding them to speak Irish. This went on, however, I would say, without much avail. But in the 17th century, Irish culture was dealt such a severe blow that from that moment on, English had a great deal more security. And in the 18th century, more English was spoken in Ireland. Then in the 19th century, through the so-called famine, which we have treated on an earlier lecture, through the so-called famine and the establishment of an English school system, the English language made great inroads, so that we might say within the past 100 years, the English language has made its greatest success in Ireland. Now, that does not mean that Irish has ever died out. It is still the native tongue of a small percentage of the population, perhaps no more than 10%. But it is a remarkable thing that the schools have succeeded in making almost everyone, particularly if we say everyone below 30, making almost everyone well acquainted and to a greater or lesser extent fluent in the native tongue. The problem remains, however, whether it will succeed. The government, I think with justice, has been accused of a certain amount of feebleness in its effort. It has been in favor of the language and yet has not taken some very obvious steps that would ensure the success of the language. The difficulty remains then. There are three great problems in Ireland. The industrialization of the country must, in order to provide employment for greater numbers, must develop. Partition, some solution must be found for partition. Lastly, the language, if it means all that the Irish people think it must mean, must be restored. Now, there's a certain kind of attitude in Ireland. Some people are completely indifferent. Other people have what we might call a peasant attitude, not able to appreciate perhaps the complexities of the question. So I'd like to close my reference to the language with the words of the Prime Minister of Ireland, Mr. Lamass, who has said this: "The economic development of this country necessitates a concerted and sustained effort of the whole people, an effort that must be as much the product of patriotism as of personal advantage." And then he goes on to say, "Patriotism is the product of love of country, of the traditions, culture, and characteristics of our people, and the Irish language is part of that heritage." So there the question stands, with a brief review of the three great problems of modern Ireland, all interrelated. And in the last moment of this last lecture, let me thank you for the overwhelming and very, very encouraging response. It has been a great pleasure to me and to the station, I am sure, that your interest has been so valuable. I thank you very much for what has been a work not of effort at all, but of great joy and pleasure in reviewing with you certain aspects of the culture and history of a great country, of a country whose connections with our own are most intimate and, I might say, old.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA-TV, Twin City Area Educational Television Corporation. This has been the final program in this series. Host and lecturer has been Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph T. McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.